Around 2560 before the Common Era, a royal inspector named Merer logged the day's ration delivery at the Giza workers' camp. His papyrus journal survived 4,500 years, sealed in a cave on the Red Sea coast. His name, his job, and exactly what his crews received are still there in original ink. Number 19 stopped archaeologists cold when they dug up the workers' village and found something that doesn't fit the story of slaves and starvation. Number 7 was potent enough that the pharaoh reserved it for sacred nights. And number 1 is the food that changes how you see who actually built this pyramid. 2,000 years of assumptions got this wrong. These men were not starving. They were provisioned in remarkable detail, eating things that will genuinely surprise you. Hit subscribe, because what they put on the table to build the greatest pyramid in history is a story worth knowing. Here are 25 foods Egyptian pyramid workers actually ate while building the Great Pyramids. Number 25. Emmer wheat flatbread. The most basic building block of any pyramid worker's day was a dense, heavy round of emmer bread baked on hot stone. Emmer wheat, tougher and coarser than modern varieties, was ground into flour in massive communal bakeries at Giza, capable of feeding thousands of men at a time. Each laborer received up to 10 loaves a day as part of their official ration, distributed before the morning shift. The bread was thick, gritty with stone particles, and it sat in the stomach for hours. Not a luxury. Machine fuel, precision engineered for sustained physical labor in the open sun. Without it, the pyramid stops. The bakery excavations at Giza are among the most thoroughly documented food sites in the ancient world, and the scale of production there changes everything you think you know about how this project was actually run. Number 24. Heket beer. Call it bread in liquid form. Heket, ancient Egypt's daily beer, was brewed from fermented emmer bread loaves soaked in water, thickened with barley mash, and strained into ceramic jars. Workers at Giza received between 4 and 5 jugs every single day, and the liquid was far closer to a nutritious grain porridge than anything a modern drinker would recognize. Low in alcohol, high in calories, and packed with B vitamins and natural yeast that the ancient diet otherwise lacked. The Egyptian medical text known as the Ebers Papyrus lists heket as an ingredient in dozens of remedies. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri, the oldest papyri ever found in Egypt, log beer deliveries to pyramid work gangs with the same precision a modern payroll officer uses for salaries. This wasn't a luxury drink. It was the caloric backbone of a workforce that moved millions of tons of stone. Number 23. Onions. Pyramid workers almost certainly ate more onions than anything else besides bread and beer. Onions grew easily along the Nile Delta, stored well in the dry Egyptian climate, and kept workers from falling sick in ways that ancient healers understood, even if they couldn't explain the mechanism. The Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt centuries later and claimed to have seen an inscription on the Great Pyramid recording the radishes, onions, and garlic consumed by the builders, a figure he translated into 1,600 silver talents. Modern scholars debate the inscription's authenticity, but the food itself is archaeologically confirmed across multiple Old Kingdom sites. Onion layers have been found pressed inside sealed chambers of Egyptian tombs, tucked alongside the dead as provisions for the afterlife. If onions were good enough to pack for eternity, they were good enough for a long shift on the Giza Plateau. Number 22. Radishes. Herodotus named them right alongside the onions, and the archaeology backs him up. Radish seeds and plant remains appear in offerings at multiple Old Kingdom tomb sites, depicted alongside other everyday vegetables in wall paintings that show the full range of what Egyptian workers actually ate. They were grown in the Nile's rich flood silt, harvested young and sharp-tasting, and eaten raw or pickled in brine. For pyramid builders working in full desert sun, a sharp, acidic vegetable was more than just flavoring. It cut through the heaviness of endless bread and dried fish, woke the palate back up, and kept the digestive system moving through a diet that was otherwise almost entirely grain-based, a small thing by the standard of a pharaoh's table. But on the plateau, a handful of radishes at noon was genuine daily relief. Number 21. Garlic. The Egyptian term for garlic appears in medical texts as a treatment for everything from heart conditions to intestinal parasites. Workers chewed it raw, added it to stews, and pressed it into bread dough. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, writing centuries later, described how Egyptian workers treated garlic and onions as objects of near religious importance, something sworn upon and relied on for strength through the heavy season. The garlic supply moved through organized distribution chains tied to royal estates, and each bunch delivered to a work gang was officially accounted for. That level of record-keeping is what makes the Pyramid Project so legible to modern historians. Nothing, not even garlic, moved through the Giza supply chain without a scribe noting it down, and that is the reason we can reconstruct the workers' diet with more confidence than almost any other ancient construction project on Earth. Number 20. Dried and salted Nile catfish. The Nile produced protein that could survive the heat. Catfish, Nile perch, and tilapia were caught in nets, salted heavily, and dried flat in the open desert air, producing a preserved fish that kept for weeks without spoiling. Workers carried dried fish as a portable ration when stationed far from camp, and excavations at Giza have found fish bones in enormous quantities in the workers' village refuse pits. One analysis estimated that the pyramid site food processing facilities could preserve tens of thousands of fish at a time during peak construction. The catfish was hard, intensely salty, and required soaking to become edible. But it delivered protein in a form that could travel, stack, and wait, which on a project that took 2 decades meant everything. The workers probably didn't love it. The evidence suggests they ate it anyway, day after day, without any complaint recorded anywhere in the historical record. Number 19. Beef. When American archaeologist Mark Lehner and his team began excavating the workers' village at Giza in the 1990s, they expected the traces of a subsistence diet. The standard story was that the pyramid was built by slaves, or at minimum by desperate laborers surviving on the bare minimum. What they found instead overturned a century of assumptions. The bones were everywhere. Cattle bones, sheep bones, goat bones, piled into refuse deposits that represented industrial-scale butchery. The Giza workers' village had a dedicated slaughterhouse complex. Analysis showed the cattle were young animals, brought to Giza specifically for slaughter, and the cuts recovered were prime portions, not scraps. Zahi Hawass, who directed excavations alongside Lehner, estimated the project consumed enough cattle to suggest workers were eating beef several times a week. A workforce fed on beef is not a slave force. It is a labor force being maintained as a long-term investment. The pharaoh needed these men functional and back on the plateau tomorrow, next month, and next year, not dead from malnutrition in 3 months. Administrative papyri confirm it. Officials tracked meat deliveries to work gangs, and the records list full carcasses, not offcuts. Foremen who fed their crews well extracted more work, and the administrators appear to have understood that equation with complete clarity. These were deliberate productivity calculations dressed up in the language of royal generosity, and the cattle bones in those refuse pits are the evidence. The workers building the Great Pyramid ate better than most free Egyptians who lived their entire lives outside the royal labor system ever did. Number 18. Lentils and chickpeas. Legumes were the slow-burn fuel of the ancient Egyptian diet, and the Giza work camps consumed them by the cartload. Lentils and chickpeas both appear in organized ration distributions, documented in administrative records listing them alongside bread and beer as standard provisions for large labor forces. They were boiled in clay pots over wood fires until soft, sometimes seasoned with salt and leek, and served as a thick, dense stew that delivered protein and complex carbohydrates in a single bowl. The caloric math was critical. A pyramid worker dragging a multi-ton stone block up a ramp in dry season needed between 4,000 and 6,000 calories a day. Lentils and bread together could hit that target in a way that dried fish alone could not. Wall paintings from Old Kingdom tombs near Giza show storage rooms stacked with sealed pottery jars, and legumes are consistently among the goods labeled in the hieroglyphic inventories alongside grain and preserved fish. Number 17. Figs. Figs grew along the Nile Valley in such abundance that they appear in tomb paintings as one of the most recognizable foods of Old Kingdom Egypt. Workers received them as a supplement to their grain rations, either fresh during harvest or dried and pressed into compact rounds that stored without refrigeration in the desert air. A dried fig is roughly 60% sugar by weight, which made it an efficient source of quick energy for men doing sustained labor through long afternoon shifts. Beyond the calories, figs carried a medicinal role. Egyptian healers prescribed fig preparations for digestive complaints, and the Ebers Papyrus lists them alongside garlic and honey as foundational ingredients in everyday remedies. For pyramid workers covering long distances between quarry staging areas and the plateau, figs pressed into a cloth pouch were the ancient equivalent of a high-energy field ration, small, dense, and reliable in a way that hot food on a long work route could never be. Number 16. Dates. No crop was more reliably Egyptian than the date palm, and no food appears more consistently across every level of ancient society. Date palms lined irrigation channels throughout the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt, producing fruit in quantities that made dates one of the cheapest and most available calories in the ancient world. Workers ate them fresh in season and dried year-round. They appear in burial offerings for ordinary Egyptians, not just in royal tombs, which tells you how central they were to the common diet. For pyramid laborers, dried dates were the easiest portable food available, resistant to heat and spoilage in a way that bread was not, and sweet enough to make the otherwise savory, salty, heavy ration bearable. Not every meal on the Giza Plateau was grim. Sometimes it ended with a handful of dates, and that small sweetness connected the laborer eating in the dust to the pharaoh's own table in ways neither of them would have thought to name. Number 15. Tiger nuts. They are not nuts at all. Tiger nuts, the small starchy tubers of a sedge grass that grew wild along the Nile banks, taste faintly sweet, slightly earthy, and satisfying in a way that doesn't match their humble appearance. The Egyptians chewed them raw as a snack, and evidence for tiger nut consumption stretches back to pre-dynastic Egypt, thousands of years before the first pyramid stone was cut. At Giza, archaeobotanical analysis of plant remains from the workers' village confirmed tiger nuts among the food debris. They were ground into a paste for drinks, pressed to extract a milky cooking liquid, or eaten whole as a between-meal energy source. Cheap, abundant, and calorie-dense tiger nuts rarely made it into the histories because nobody thought to record what the ordinary workers snacked on between shifts. The knowledge of what they actually ate came from the garbage pits, not the royal records. Number 14. Goose and wildfowl. The Nile Valley in the Old Kingdom was not the stripped, hyper-arid corridor of modern Egypt. The floodplain held vast marshlands, braided channels, and seasonal wetlands teeming with waterfowl. Ducks, geese, herons, quail, and dozens of other species migrated through annually, and the Egyptians had been hunting and farming them long before a single pyramid block was quarried. Wall paintings in Old Kingdom tombs near Giza capture the full scale of Egyptian wildfowl culture. Men in papyrus skiffs deploying enormous clap nets that swept down onto resting flocks, cooks gutting row after row of plucked carcasses hung up to dry. These were not royal hunts. They depicted the organized, industrial procurement of a common food. At the workers' village, goose and duck bones appear in the food refuse in significant quantities, and administrative records list wildfowl deliveries alongside cattle and fish in the ration accounts. On days when the primary protein was goose, workers ate well by any ancient standard. The bird was fatty and rich in a way dried fish simply was not, and the rendered goose fat served as a cooking medium, rubbed onto bread or used as a base for stews. The pharaoh's household consumed wildfowl at a completely different register. Royal estate records document massive flocks of geese force-fed grain, butchered by palace staff and prepared with imported spices by specialists. But the bird on both tables was the same goose, raised in the same Nile marshes, and that overlap ties the entire project together as a single world rather than two separate ones. If you think that was elaborate, wait until you see what was being drunk at the pharaoh's ceremonial table. Number 13. Pomegranate. Pomegranates arrived in Egypt as elite imports before gradually becoming a fixture in the broader food supply. By the Old Kingdom, they were being cultivated in Egyptian gardens and depicted in tomb offerings alongside figs and dates. The fruit carried symbolic weight associated with fertility and abundance, and it moved from the pharaoh's table into wider royal-affiliated circles, reaching the administrative and supervisory levels of the pyramid workforce during harvest season. Pomegranate juice was pressed and added to flavored drinks, the seeds eaten whole, and dried rind used medicinally to treat parasitic infections. Egyptian medical texts list pomegranate preparations for that purpose specifically. For a workforce exposed to standing water near the Nile's edge, where gut parasites were a chronic and well-documented hazard, something that kept the digestive system functioning was not an indulgence. In ancient Egypt, the boundary between food and medicine was rarely as clear as modern observers expect. Number 12. Leeks and cucumbers. Leeks and cucumbers appear throughout the visual record of Old Kingdom Egypt. Tomb paintings show them bundled together in market scenes and among the provisions of travelers, which tells you something about their portability and everyday value. For pyramid workers, leeks were added raw to bread rations or simmered into the lentil stews that cooked over campfires at night. Cucumbers, stored cool in the shade of clay storerooms, were eaten raw as a water source as much as a food. On a plateau where temperatures during construction season climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, a cool cucumber was practical hydration. Egyptian cucumbers of the period were slightly smaller and more bitter than modern varieties, but the function was identical, something to eat that also cooled the body and made the relentless midday heat briefly, mercifully bearable. Small details, the kind that make the historical record feel genuinely human. Number 11. Lotus seeds and root. The blue lotus grew in the slow-moving channels and pools of the Nile floodplain, and its seeds, pods, and roots were all edible. Lotus root, boiled until tender, was starchy and dense, providing a carbohydrate source that could supplement the grain-heavy pyramid diet during flood season when the fields were temporarily inaccessible. Both root and seed appear in Old Kingdom food deposits near Giza. The seeds were eaten dried as a snack or ground into a supplemental flour mixed with emmer. The lotus also carried deep religious significance associated with creation and the rising of the sun, which meant that eating it was never entirely a secular act. Priests consumed lotus in ritual contexts, and the line between sacred food and ordinary food in ancient Egypt was rarely as distinct as modern observers assume. Sometimes the thing on the altar was also the thing in the cooking pot. Number 10. Salt and natron. Salt was not simply a seasoning in ancient Egypt. It was a preservation technology, a ritual substance, and a controlled state resource managed through organized distribution networks. Workers at Giza received salt as a standard part of their ration, used to preserve the Nile fish arriving from the delta and to season the grain-heavy food that otherwise tasted of very little. Natron, a naturally occurring sodium carbonate harvested from dry lake beds west of the Nile Delta, served a second function. In industrial volumes, it was the desiccant used in mummification. In smaller amounts, it was added to drinking water as a purifier, reducing microbial growth in ceramic jars exposed to the desert heat. Whether the workers understood the hygiene mechanism is unlikely, but the practice appears in both medical texts and administrative records as a standard precaution. Clean water on a site housing thousands of men was the operational difference between a functional workforce and an epidemic. Number 9. Emmer porridge with rendered fat. When the bread ovens were running behind schedule or grain stocks ran low during a long desert season, workers cooked emmer wheat directly into a thick porridge over campfires. Easier to prepare than bread and requiring only a clay pot and water, the addition of rendered animal fat transformed it from bare subsistence into something genuinely warming and sustaining. The slaughterhouse complex at Giza's workers' village produced rendered cattle and goose fat in large quantities as a byproduct of the butchery, and that fat moved through the same distribution channels as the grain and fish rations. Administrative records from the Wadi al-Jarf papyri document fat deliveries to pyramid supply depots alongside grain, suggesting it was a standard ration addition rather than an occasional bonus. Desert nights at Giza drop sharply in temperature during the construction seasons of spring and autumn. A clay bowl of hot emmer porridge with fat and a few pressed dates on the side was the closest thing to comfort food the plateau could offer. Number 8. Gazelle. The pharaoh hunted gazelle. So did his senior officials, priests, and teams of professional hunters attached to royal estates. Gazelle bones appear at elite Old Kingdom sites near Giza, and mastaba tomb wall paintings consistently depict hunting scenes where gazelle and oryx appear as prestige game taken on organized desert expeditions. For the pharaoh personally, a gazelle taken on a morning hunt in the western desert was not merely a meal. It was a demonstration of physical power, royal virility, and control over the natural world, all inseparable from the religious authority the pharaoh claimed over the pyramid project itself. Workers on the construction site did not eat gazelle. The food hierarchy at Giza was that strict, but the royal household and senior administrators ate it regularly, and supplying a royal court with fresh wild game while managing the largest construction project in human history tells you something about the organizational reach of the pharaoh's administration. The food at the top of the hierarchy was never allowed to be ordinary. Number 7. Blue lotus wine. The blue lotus of the Nile was not just a flower. In the Old Kingdom, it was a psychoactive substance consumed in ritual contexts by pharaohs, priests, and members of the royal household, and the evidence is surprisingly direct. Nymphea caerulea contains a porphine and nuciferine, two alkaloids that produce mild euphoria, heightened visual perception, and a dreamlike relaxation in sufficient quantity. The Egyptians didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the effect, and they encoded it into the artistic record with remarkable consistency. Wall paintings from this period show figures at royal feasts holding blue lotus blossoms to their noses and petals submerged in wine cups, in contexts that can't be read as purely decorative. The preparation appears to have been straightforward: lotus petals and stamens steeped in wine for an extended period, producing an infused drink consumed during festivals, religious ceremonies, and elaborate feasts of state significance. The construction of the Great Pyramid was the most significant state event of Khufu's entire reign, and documented feast periods accompanied its ceremonial phases. Whether blue lotus wine appeared at those specific feasts is not directly attested in surviving texts, but it appears in nearly every other documented context of elite Egyptian ceremonial eating from the same period, and its association with divine communication and altered perception made it exactly the substance a pharaoh would reach for on nights of religious weight. The workers on the plateau drank heket, the thick fermented grain beer that filled their ration jars. The pharaoh and his inner circle drank something with a fundamentally different purpose. One substance kept bodies going. The other reached toward something else entirely. Number 6. Imported Levantine olive oil. Egypt grew sesame and pressed its own cooking oils from local sources, but olive oil was different. Olive trees didn't thrive in the Egyptian climate, and the finest olive oil consumed at the pharaoh's table came through trade networks stretching into the Levant, what is today Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. It arrived at Egyptian ports in sealed ceramic vessels and moved through palace distribution systems before reaching royal kitchens. Its presence in the Old Kingdom dietary record tells you how extensive those networks already were. The pharaoh building the Great Pyramid around 2560 before the Common Era had access to goods produced more than 1,000 miles away. Egyptian ships were making regular runs to the Levantine coast, trading gold, grain, and papyrus for cedar timber, resins, and oil. The olive oil dressed the roasted meats served at royal feasts and preserved certain foods sealed in storage jars. Workers on the plateau used rendered animal fat. The distinction between those two cooking mediums was not accidental and was not unnoticed by anyone involved. Number 5. Carob. The carob tree grew along the Nile Valley and across the eastern Mediterranean, and its thick, sweet, dark brown pods were the most concentrated source of natural sugar in the ancient Egyptian pantry outside of honey. Workers and officials alike ate carob pods raw or ground them into a paste used as a sweetener in bread and grain preparations. The pods kept almost indefinitely without processing, making them ideal for long-term storage at supply depots along the routes connecting the quarry sites at Tura and Aswan to the Giza Plateau. Egyptian medical texts mention carob explicitly as a treatment for digestive complaints, particularly as a gentle remedy for diarrhea, which on a site housing thousands of workers eating communally in the heat was a serious and recurring problem. That carob appears in both the food record and the medical record tells you something important about how ancient Egyptians thought about eating. The line between fueling the body and treating it was never particularly distinct, and the most useful foods were always both. Number 4. Roasted ox heart. Not every part of the cattle slaughtered at Giza's worker complex was a prime cut. The heart, liver, kidneys, and lungs were distributed to workers as supplemental protein, and the evidence appears in the bones, the butchery marks on those bones, and the cooking vessels recovered from the site. Roasting on an open fire was the most practical preparation available. Ox heart is a dense, intensely flavored muscle that delivers a caloric punch disproportionate to its size, and for workers doing sustained heavy labor through long shifts, that density mattered more than any consideration of flavor. Egyptian ritual practice also gave the heart a specific symbolic meaning. It was understood as the seat of intelligence and character, weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the great afterlife judgment. Eating the heart of a strong animal was thought to transfer something of that strength. Whether the laborers held that belief is not recorded, but the ox heart was not thrown away. It was prepared, distributed, and eaten by people who understood it as food worth having. Number 3. Oxtail stew. Oxtail cooked slow in a clay pot is one of the most forgiving preparations in any cuisine, and the ancient Egyptians reached this conclusion independently. The tail was a bony, gelatinous cut, requiring hours of simmering before it became edible, but the collagen in the bones dissolved into the cooking liquid to produce a stock of unusual richness, eaten as a stew or drunk as a warming broth. At Giza, the workers who managed the slaughterhouse and cooking operations were organized into named crews with specific duties, and the Wadi al-Jarf papyri document meal preparation and cooking assignments alongside the construction records. The evidence suggests communal cooking for large groups was managed by a dedicated kitchen operation rather than leaving each laborer to feed himself. On heavy construction days, the kitchen crews had oxtail stew, lentil soup, and roasted fish ready before the work gangs returned. It was not elegant food, but it was organized, consistent, and hot, and arriving at camp after a full day moving 6-ton limestone blocks in the desert sun that counted for more than any refinement could provide. Number 2. Honeyed wine from Canaan. Wine in ancient Egypt was an elite product before it became anything else. The Nile Delta produced some wine, in vineyards attached to royal estates and temple properties, but the finest wine consumed by the pharaoh and his inner circle came from Canaan, the Levantine hill country that today encompasses parts of Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. Canaanite wine arrived in sealed ceramic amphorae stamped with the estate of origin and sometimes the production year, making the Old Kingdom wine trade one of the earliest documented systems of wine provenance in human history. Honey was added in 2 contexts: as a preservation agent that extended shelf life in the heat, and as a deliberate flavoring that smoothed the harsh edge of imperfectly fermented batches. The pharaoh's wine steward managed the palace cellar with rigorous accounting, and period records document wine deliveries by type, origin, and quantity. Workers at Giza received Heket beer. The royal household received Canaanite wine. The distance between those 2 tables was the distance between ordinary life and the world the pyramid was being built to permanently represent. Number 1. The workers' burial bread. In 1990, a tourist's horse stumbled near the edge of the Giza Plateau and broke through the surface into a previously undiscovered tomb. Below it lay the burial chambers of the men who had built the Great Pyramid, and what archaeologists found inside rewrote a story that had been circulating for 2,000 years. Herodotus had written of a slave army driven to misery, and modern popular culture had built its image of pyramid construction on coercion and forced labor. But these were not the graves of slaves. The tombs were organized, maintained, and dignified. They bore the names and titles of their occupants in hieroglyphic inscriptions: crew foremen, gang supervisors, skilled craftsmen who had worked on the Great Pyramid during the reign of Khufu, who had lived full lives, been honored in their communities, and been buried by people who cared about them. And in the tombs, alongside the bodies, were food offerings, bread loaves, specifically a distinctive conical form of bread that appears almost exclusively in workers' burials from this period. It was not placed there by officials or as part of a state ritual. It was baked for the dead by the people who mourned them and carried to the tomb as personal provision for the journey ahead. That bread is the most human thing in the entire archaeological record of the Great Pyramid. Not the engineering calculations, not the administrative papyri logging ration deliveries. The bread, baked and carried to a grave by a wife, a child, a sibling who wanted the person they had lost to have something to eat wherever they were going. The workers who built the Great Pyramid ate bread every day of their working lives. When they died, the people who mourned them made sure bread followed them. The pyramid was built by people who ate, who were fed by an organized state, and who were buried with care by people who loved them. That is the real history the stones contain. Which one surprised you the most? Leave it in the comments below, because a lot of people assume the pyramid builders were starved into submission, and the evidence tells a very different story. These were men who received beef rations, organized communal meals, and enough calories to sustain one of the hardest physical jobs in human history, day after day, year after year. The pharaoh ate gazelle and drank wine infused with lotus petals. His workers ate bread, beer, onions, and roasted meat on a plateau 4,500 years ago, and the records of what they ate survived in clay jars, animal bones, and papyrus accounts written by men whose names we still know. If you enjoyed this look at what the builders of the Great Pyramid actually ate, hit subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. We'll see you there.